Assalamu alaikum, students. So we continue with our circulation lectures, and today we will discuss blood pressure control, both acute, look at it, what are the acute mechanisms, i.e. short-term, quick mechanisms, and long-term mechanisms. So basically there are two broad learning objectives today. One is the importance of blood pressure control, and the second are the actual mechanisms, which form a timeline of how they address any change in blood pressure. So, uh, what's uh, the whole concept about? We mentioned this in the initial part, the first few lectures of circulation, that amongst the main 3-4 tenets of circulatory control, circulation overall, one of those pillars is actually blood pressure control. Uh, we look at the importance of things by how much investment we do for a particular concept or a mechanism. So today you will notice that to control the blood pressure within a certain range, the body implies several mechanisms spanning over a very broad and impressive timeline to keep this blood pressure in control. So why is it that blood pressure is so much important? Well, the one line answer is because it determines, it's one of the main determinants of tissue perfusion, that the whole point of circulation is to supply blood to organs. And if you don't have adequate perfusion pressure, uh, you can't do that, okay? So let me start with an example uh, to justify this line, that cardiovascular system needs to maintain just mean arterial pressure and that tissues just tap into it. Think of an overhead uh, water reservoir, as you see in residential colonies all over your cities. These big sort of monuments of cities, which you can see from afar, these are big water collection reservoirs, which are intentionally made at a significant height. Okay, so they are way above the average height of houses, flats, and other residential schemes. So what's the point here? Why are they high, and what's the whole architecture? So water is collected by virtue of pumps. We call them donkey pumps. Water is collected in these reservoirs. Okay, and then it stays there. These tanks are then connected to their respective residential societies. And so, for example, if you are a person living on the ground floor of a house, uh, all your taps, all your supply is connected to this, eventually is connected to this overhead huge water tank or water reservoir. Okay. Uh, all you need to do is open a tap. Okay, because the pressure is so much, because you have created a delta P, a huge delta P, by raising the water column way above the level of your house. So when you open up any tap of water, you let that whole column of water to allow to come out of that tap, and hence you have flowing water. It's a very simple concept. So all you need to do is maintain the water presence in this tank, and you will have running water. It's when you run out of the tank water is when you get problems with your water supply, right? So it just put this very simple example to the cardiovascular system, that the heart and circulation together, i.e. cardiac output and total peripheral resistance. Okay, you need to be comfortable with these two terms now. They should ensure that the arterial side of circulation has adequate pressure, so that whenever an organ uh, needs to increase its share of blood, it can quote unquote just open up a tap. Okay. Uh, while at resting condition, it is ensured that every organ will get their basal level blood supply anyway. And in case, as I said, if this requirement is to increase, all they need to do is vasodilate their vessel, i.e., quote unquote, open the tap, and there'll be increased blood. Okay, so that's why cardiovascular system, rather than going into every organ and trying to regulate it heavily, uh, it's really the organs are autonomous in their own blood supplies. The cardiovascular system invests a lot in maintaining the central blood pressure, if I may use this term, which is called the arterial blood pressure, just to ensure that the water tank is always filled up with water, proverbially speaking. Okay, so there are two main factors, two main divisions of this regulation. One is nervous, in which we'll study the various central nervous system mediated responses to blood pressure regulation, and the other is hormone. And this is the timeline that I was mentioning. It's divided into, there are 7 regulatory mechanisms. So there it is. And it's divided across 3 dimensions: acute, intermediate, and long term. These are time dimensions. So acute means immediate, intermediate means somewhere in between, and long term means months and hours to weeks to months, and so on. So this is what I was saying. Acute is seconds to minutes, intermediate is after many minutes, and long term is basically weeks to years. Now, you will see a list of mechanisms under each heading. I just wanted to just go through it, and we'll be discussing each in some detail. Acute, number 1, the most famous is baroreceptor reflex. Number 2 is CNS ischemic response. Then you have the chemoreceptor response. Intermediate, you have again 3, and renin angiotensin vasoconstrictor mechanism, stress relaxation and fluid shift. And in the long term, you have renin angiotensin, but it's replaced by aldosterone system. So in long term, you have basically an aldosterone system which addresses these things. Let me just say a few words, general words, before we go into the nitty gritty of things. Acute mechanisms should always be viewed as uh, uh, saving the day kind of mechanism. So if they don't come into play within literally seconds, the whole game may be lost. So if somebody comes in, experiences, God forbid, a road traffic accident and starts to bleed, the blood pressure will obviously plummet. uh, there is no point in this person, depending on his intermediate mechanisms or long-term mechanisms, if the acute mechanisms within seconds don't save the day for him, those few important crucial hours, to save his life at that particular time, so that afterwards these mechanisms can come and bring back the whole system back to normal. So during emergencies, during urgencies, you will have your baroreceptor reflex working in and out. Then you have the CNS ischemic response working as a last ditch response, as we'll see. And chemoreceptor is a relatively minor concept in circulatory physiology. You have studied this in detail in respiratory physiology. So this is what I wanted to say about acute mechanisms as opposed to later on mechanisms, especially the long term. A few words about long term is usually it relates to kidney, as is the case here, and kidney basically comes to the party late. But the feature of kidney is that it brings the whole disturbance which got it involved in the first place back to normal. Dot. Acute mechanisms are not known for their accuracy, but kidney is. Okay. Acute mechanisms are known for their speed, and hence the speed comes at some sort of a crudeness in terms of bringing the whole thing down to naught. However, the long term, i.e., kidney mediated responses, although they are late to be triggered. However, they are known for their accurate uh, uh, bringing the whole thing back to normal, whether it's blood pressure, whether it's pH control, whether it's uh, osmolarity, everything that kidney does, it does it slowly, but it brings the whole thing back to mathematical equilibrium. Okay, so I borrowed this very excellent diagram of Guyton from from his second chapter on. Mind you, there are two chapters dealing with blood pressure control. The first is acute and intermediate, and the second one is long term. So I picked this from the summary right at the end of the second chapter of blood pressure control, and it gives you very nice timeline, as you can see, seconds, minutes, hours to days, and so on to infinity really, and it plots all these mechanisms as a feedback gain statistic, and you can see how on the continuum these seven play out, and the really the three, if you can see, you are able to, you'll be able to study this in detail when you open up your books. But right now you can see that the three prominent ones, I would say, is the black one, the baroreceptor one. Look at how quickly it is literally the first thing that happens after any acute change in pressure. So the first thing that happens is baroreceptor reflex. It goes and peaks, then it flattens, and then it within minutes to hours also drops back. So within days, you will lose your baroreceptor reflex as a mechanism to against any blood pressure fluctuation if you don't address it within those days. So if the blood pressure change is of a significantly worse nature, baroreceptor reflex will tirelessly work till days, maybe 3 to 4 days. But then, since they are basically acute in nature, they will die down and come back and be of no use after days. You see that CNS ischemic response being the second acute, most important acute mechanism, also comes in, does its business. However, it's much more higher feedback loop again, but again, sort of tapers off and fades away in the background. So these are the two important ones. Then you have lots of intermediate low feedback gain mechanisms going on in the background. Then you get this red line. Check this red line out. This red line is basically kidney. So the kidney response to changes in blood pressure, blood volume is important. So kidney basically what it does, it brings the whole thing back to normal, to mathematical normal, as I said, and its gain is literally approaching infinity. So you can throw anything at blood pressure. Eventually, if it doesn't take the person's life, eventually kidney will sort it out. Okay, let's move on. So we start with the acute mechanisms, and as I said, the first is baroreceptor, the second is CNS ischemic response, and the minor one is chemoreceptor mechanism. First up is baroreceptor reflex. So what are baroreceptors? As the name indicates, baroreceptors are basically pressure sensing receptors, and there are many across circulation, but two most famous ones are depicted here at the bifurcation of the carotids. Okay, right here. This is the carotid sinus, and then tucked underneath are the aortic baroreceptors right here. You will also notice that they are their neighbors, immediate neighbors are carotid and aortic chemoreceptors as well. Okay, so baroreceptors and chemoreceptors basically they reside close by in the same site, more found in aorta and carotids, but as I mentioned earlier, they are also found elsewhere in the body. However, these are the ones which mediate the famous baroreceptor reflex. Okay, as you can see, this is a Guyton diagram. These baroreceptors, they basically have afferents going up to the brainstem, where they integrate with CNS centers, and then you have efferents coming down and doing their business. Okay, this is a much more detailed diagram, and here you will be introduced to, when you read your books, you'll be introduced to uh, this center. Now, where is this center? This center is in the brainstem. Brainstem is medulla plus pons. So remember, you know, if you have been to a big nice hotel, you'll always find there's a section for businessmen, and it's called a business center. And there you'll find all sorts of internet facilities, fax, photocopying. Uh, they used to have telex back in the days. Now you have fax and all sorts of these things just to facilitate people who are doing business and have to communicate, correspond with their companies far away, this, that, the other. So that's the business center. So I usually use this word business center for brainstem, because brainstem has your most important centers collected in one place. You, as you remember, in respiratory physiology, we studied that respiratory centers reside here. So today, you need to notice that the cardiovascular regulatory nuclei, neurons, also reside here. And the main collection, cascade of these neurons is basically the vasomotor center. This is shown, this is the vasomotor center. And you can, as you can see, it has multiple nuclei in it. So it's a collection of neurons. And then within the collection, you have specialized neurons doing their own business, okay? And this resides in brainstem, ideally located for it to mediate um, incoming information from the periphery, take the dictation from cerebral cortex, but mainly negotiating everything and maintaining everything under subconsciously, automatically, because all of this stuff under the cerebral cortex, all of this stuff is unconscious. You don't have any control over it. You have control over your cerebral cortex, however. So just a parting note on the cerebral cortex. Basically, this is your conscious control. So yes, when you are scared or when you are relaxed, that has an effect on your blood pressure, because cerebral cortex, as you can see here, has an effect on hypothalamus, which is the master gland, master area. Uh, I beg your pardon. It's the main area which has lots and lots of functions, as you'll be studying in your next year of MBBS. Uh, so higher centers do have an input on hypothalamus. Hypothalamus also controls blood pressure via the vasomotor center, and hence any conscious changes in mood, any emergencies perceived, any images which you find either nice or disturbing, sounds, all that sort of thing, memories, they have an effect on blood pressure via this input, okay? But when you talk about the mundane, the day to day, it's automatic. And why is it automatic? This is why it's automatic, right? So you know what afferents are. These are nerve action potentials which are generated at the receptors, and they travel back to the CNS. In this case, all those baroreceptors at the aortic arch and the carotids bifurcation, they generate the very important signals about blood pressure, any fluctuation in that, and send it off to the brainstem vasomotor center, where in the vasomotor center, their first port of call is nucleus tractus solitarius, NTS. Basically, this you should note integrates all the afferent information about blood pressure, okay? And then, like a good postal service, disseminates this information in three directions. One is to send it off to higher centers via the hypothalamus to give you a sensation of uh, uh, weirdness when the BP goes down, or slight tense or anxious when the BP goes up. Then, very importantly, look at this input to the sympathetic vasoconstrictor center within the vasomotor center. Short of it is the VMC. Then there is a vagal vasodilator or cardio decelerator center. We will talk about this in a bit. So when NTS receives all the afferent information, it basically stimulates the vagal area and inhibits the sympathetic area. This is an important point to note for first year medical students. This is one of those very common mistakes, conceptual mistakes, silly mistake really, because it's very straightforward. You need to just remember that NTS, when stimulated by afferent information, it inhibits the sympathetic center and activates the vagal center. Okay, this bit you need to remember. Okay, and that within them there is obviously a negative feedback loop. So when sympathetic gets turned on, as an example, it will basically snub the vagal center and vice versa. Okay, uh, this bit I won't go into details here because we'll be discussing baroreceptor reflex in detail in the next slides. I will just complete this whole discussion by saying that you now should know that what is the effect of autonomic nervous system on the heart. So when we say that sympathetic stimulation is, say, inhibited, uh, what will happen to the heart when that happens? And if we say that vagal or parasympathetic stimulation occurs, increases, how will it affect the heart? You should be in a position to now comment on that. Okay. Well, very quickly, we'll say that parasympathetic stimulation basically slows down the heart, while it does not have a very high effect on its contractility. Sympathetic, on the other hand, has both effects. When it gets stimulated, it increases the heart rate and contractility. Okay, so that's the heart done. Blood vessels. In blood vessels, parasympathetic does not play a huge role. However, sympathetic does. Okay, and it all depends on, as we've been discussing, it all depends on the receptor, whether it's alpha 1 or beta 1. Okay. So that's that. For this slide, you have understood VMC, where it's located, what does it constitute, and very importantly, the circuit diagram of these three subnuclei. Now the baroreceptor reflex. So basically, imagine that blood pressure has gone down due to whatever reason. Blood pressure has gone down. Okay. Uh, and when I say blood pressure, I basically mean mean arterial pressure, MAP. Okay, that has gone down. So baroreceptor reflexes, basically they are stretch reflexes. Okay, so at all times in a person who's alive, he or she will have a blood pressure, and hence there will be a constant force on the walls of the blood vessels. So when you have a constant force acting on a vessel which contains a stretch receptor, you can imagine that that stretch receptor will be in a state of stretch at all times, right? Now what you've done is you have decreased that blood pressure. So the blood pressure has gone down, the degree of stretch of the wall has gone down, and so the receptor itself, the baroreceptor, has the degree of stretch on it has decreased. Okay, so when that has decreased, as you can see here, its firing rate, because look, it's a stretch receptor. The more you stretch it, the more activation you cause in it, and hence it becomes more active. It then throws out more volleys of action potential along its afferent. NTS receives more supply of incoming volleys of action potential, and it increases its the three things that it's supposed to do, right? If you remember the VMC diagram. Now, in this scenario, you have decreased firing rate of, say, the carotid sinus nerve, okay? So you can imagine that the NTS in this case will receive less a number of impulses, and all over its, the function of it, what normally it's doing, if you remember, what is it doing? Let me just go back, refer you back to the VMC. What is the NTS doing? Normally, it is keeping a check, an inhibitory check on the sympathetics, and it's normally activating the parasympathetics. Again, as I mentioned earlier, this is a very crucial circuit diagram that you need to remember. So in case of decreased blood pressure, what we were discussing, what happens is uh, when these impulses decrease in their amount, as is the case with blood pressure going down, decreasing blood pressure, the NTS's inhibition on the sympathetic subnucleus, sub neurons decreases. Okay. To understand it, let me give you the opposite. If you overactivate NTS, okay, this inhibition will increase naturally because that's the nature of relationship. But if you make it weak, okay, this is a better way of saying it. If you make it weak, the sympathetic will come out of its inhibition. Okay, the signals from NTS, if they weaken due to less activation from the afferents, because the stretch has decreased and also and all that story that I told you, this effect on sympathetic system dwindles, it goes down, and this effect on the the vagus, it basically decreases. So net result is sympathetic system will announce its liberty, freedom from the inhibitory, uh, tyrannical effect of the NTS, and it will activate itself. It will affect the heart. It will affect the blood vessels with what it's supposed to do: increase the heart rate, increase heart contractility, vasoconstrict the vessels, and at the same time, the parasympathetic nuclei, they were actually being supported by the NTS. But in this case, since NTS has now weakened, quote unquote, please don't write that. This is all conceptual. Uh, since this has weakened, the vagus basically sort of switches off. And this sits in nicely with your activation of the sympathetic, because these two don't see eye to eye. And if vagus goes down, parasympathetic goes down, this basically liberates the heart from any slowing down. Okay. And sympathetics can now properly drive the heart in the positive direction. So coming back to the circuit diagram, remember the flow chart rather. Remember, this is the main flow chart, and if when you get a question in your professional examination, we are expecting you to draw something like this to show your understanding, clear understanding of how you understand this whole thing. And it doesn't really matter if you get a generic question which does not give you a scenario in which whoever is suffering from fluctuation in blood pressure has been shown to decrease his or her blood pressure or increase. If you don't get that direction from your question, it's really up to you whether you want to make this flow chart as a decrease in blood pressure flow chart or an increase in blood pressure flow chart. Both are equally valid. So we were at the decreased firing rate of carotid sinus part here. And this basically, now you can understand that this will, all of the afferents going into NTS will actually decrease. Okay. This has an effect on the sympathetic side of things and the parasympathetic side of things. Let's get this out of the way first. Parasympathetic activity of the heart decreases. This in itself raises the heart rate, since you know that it doesn't have any significant contribution towards the contractility. Parasympathetics really are concerned with heart rate. Increasing heart rate will tend to improve the cardiac output and hence blood pressure. Okay, it's the sympathetic side which has the juice here, and by increasing activity of sympathetics to the heart and blood vessels, you have all sorts of things: increased heart rate, increased contractility. In the arterioles, you have increased TPR, total peripheral resistance, because of constriction. Important point to note here, which often gets doesn't get enough attention from students, is the constriction of veins. We always talk about a constriction of arterioles, but now since it's a generic turn on of the sympathetic activity, and sympathetics, as I mentioned earlier, affect not just the arterioles but also the veins. So when you constrict a vein, remember veins have a reservoir function, and that blood that they were holding up for such an event basically now gets into play. And when it gets constricted, it basically gives out that reserved stored volume, improves the venous return. And when you know that venous return improves due to Frank-Starling law, you have increased cardiac output. Again, all of this contributes towards increasing in arterial blood pressure. PA here is arterial pressure. arterial blood pressure. So it's a classical reflex. It started off with decrease of pressure and ended up with an increase of pressure through a plethora of activities. Okay, this is your baroreceptor reflex. Now, Guyton talks about very nicely about various features of baroreceptor reflex. Please remember, throughout this discussion, baroreceptor reflex is an acute mechanism. It is not designed for long term. It is acute, and it has some triggers, some handles through which the body exploits it. So the carotids basically are very sensitive around the 100 mmHg mark. This is your normal mean arterial pressure, and anything which fluctuates this mean arterial pressure, the carotids really respond very spectacularly well to any fluctuation. The maximum is 180, beyond which they just fall off the grid. And very important to note is that at lower pressures, they're not very sensitive. So around the 0 to 60 mark, they're not exquisitely stimulated. They are basically looking at around 100 mmHg. So what if your blood pressure goes below 100, hits below 60? What happens then? Well, baroreceptor is not what happens. It's basically the second mechanism, the CNS ischemic response, which we'll study after this. Okay. So this is done. Aortic baroreceptors is basically they operate at 30 mmHg higher than carotids. So that's that. This graph basically just tells you that the maximum number of impulses per change in pressure is around 100, something that we've done here. So this is the sensitivity. Then you have the speed. Very important to note is that if the change in pressure is pulsatile rather than constant, then baroreceptors are most happy to oblige. So if you have a situation where you have a constant increase in pressure, one straight waveform, a baroreceptor won't respond. However, if you have a pulsatile pressure, so delta peak comes and goes, just like this, just as in the aorta. During systole, it goes up, during diastole, it comes down, then it goes up again, then it comes down. This is what we mean by pulsatile, okay? Not one straight line, one straight graph going up only, but pulsatile. So when it's pulsatile, impulses, number of impulses coming out of, say, the carotids is very high, okay? So as you can see, when it goes up, you have a change in traffic. I'll comment on the differences here, but just to give you an overall concept first, that when it goes up, the baroreceptor responds by its increasing in firing rate of its baroreceptors, and when the pressure comes down, it basically slows down the firing rate. Okay, just remember that it's a stretch receptor. If the pressure inside the vessel goes up during cardiac systole, naturally the valve will be stretched, the baroreceptor will be stretched. When it's stretched, it becomes activated, and the number of impulses that it can generate increases. And when it's unstretched, the opposite happens. Okay. Now, what is this? What is this? They have plotted this whole thing against various mean arterial pressure. So notice that at lower pressure, say the lowest, it's just registers one graph point, okay? Because as we mentioned, below 60, it's least stimulated, okay? Check out 100. So 100 and above, it really responds quite impressively to any stretches, any increases in pressure, and goes nicely quiet during unstretching. So it's this pressure around which it's most happy. And above 200 and more, it's just goes berserk, because it doesn't get time to relax and decrease its firing rate. The pressure is so much that the activation that happens during the upstroke uh, doesn't really die down during the diastole before the next upstroke comes. Okay. Anyway, if you don't remember anything, just remember that around 100, it's the response is most sensitive, and pulsatile is the way to go as opposed to constant pressure. Okay, so we say that baroreceptor reflex is basically your bread and butter pressure buffering system, uh, you borrow from it all the time, really. Literally, every time you stand from a sitting position, you employ your baroreceptor reflex. So very quickly, we'll be talking about this tomorrow in scenarios, integration scenarios of the cardiovascular system. But just a footnote here is when you stand, you basically go against gravity. So you are going against gravity by standing from a sitting position. As you lunge forwards and upwards, what happens is blood tends to pool in the lower part of the body, and the blood pressure tends to drop at the baroreceptors, aortic and carotid ones. It's that second, literally second, of the drop in blood pressure that is picked up by the baroreceptor. So imagine when you're sitting, your mean arterial pressure is 100 mmHg, and as you now go into a standing position, that 100 mmHg dropped a few degrees downwards. Immediately it's picked up by the baroreceptor reflex, and the whole flow chart should now come to your head. What will happen? And in literally in seconds, it improves the blood pressure back to 100 due to that whole sympathetic system activation. So maintenance of blood pressure in the daily routine activities is basically the function of this buffering system we call baroreceptors. This graph shows you that when you have a normal baroreceptor reflex functioning, look at the fluctuations around 100. They are very nicely kept in the middle of these fluctuations. So you can go up or you can go down, but you will always find yourself coming back to the center of it. However, when you, in an experimental animal preparation, when you denervated the baroreceptors, you cut off the nerve, uh, and now you fluctuate the blood pressure, you see really wild stuff going all over the place of this blood pressure. It's not regulated. Okay, now comes to the last, but probably one of the most important bits that I have been talking about. It is an acute mechanism. So you really cannot depend on it in the long term. In fact, it's kind of uh, let me say, party pooper in the long term, and it actually joins the quote unquote enemies in the long term. So in that sense, it's funny. What I mean to say is, say for example, you have a change in mean arterial pressure from 100 to 130. Yeah, mean arterial pressure was 100, now it's 130, and it's just started now. 0 second, 1 second, 2 second, 3, and so on and so forth. So as we have studied, uh, it's an acute mechanism. As soon as the change will happen, it will go into overdrive. It will try to address this whole thing by the mechanisms that we've studied. Um, in this case, since we are discussing increased mean arterial pressure as opposed to decrease, what should it do? In increase, there's too much traffic going up. NTS becomes very busy. It really snubs the sympathetic nervous system, and hence the resultant is vasodilation. Uh, that should save the day and bring the blood pressure down. But let's assume that it doesn't, that the pathology, the whole disturbance that caused the increase in blood pressure in the first place, just stays on and on and on, okay, over over hours to maybe days, okay. Now, what happens then to the baroreceptor is that it keeps on switching, it keeps on trying to help the situation by snubbing it down by the whole reflex. But when it fails to do that over days, it actually resets. It then resets to the new pressure. So in this case, it will reset around 130. That's what I meant by it's funny in the long term. That it basically had its head focus at 100, but since it failed, it basically changed the goalpost and now starts to believe, quote unquote, that 130 is the new pressure, and it will just work around that. That's why hypertension is such a bad thing to have. In that you obviously have increased sustained increased blood pressures over a long time. And that's why the diagnosis of hypertension is arrived at. So in that scenario, the baroreceptor reflex really you have sort of switched them off basically, because the new pressures are high, and baroreceptor has absolutely no give here, no say here. Okay, this is called accommodation. It's an important question, can be asked in vivas, can be asked in SEQs as well. Accommodation is when the receptor accommodates to a newer pressure, and this signifies the role that it plays in short term, not long term. Okay, that's done. That's baroreceptor. Coming to CNS ischemic response. Remember, we are talking about CNS ischemic. So alarm bells should go on in your head. There is ischemia in the CNS. What's going on here? And we did mention that baroreceptor reflex do not work below 60. They are exquisitely sensitive around 100. So what happens? Who is the hero below 60? Well, you're looking at it. So basically, VMC, i.e., vasomotor center, is residing in the CNS, as we mentioned. And any ischemia, you know what ischemia is. Cerebral is related to cerebrum, i.e., the brain itself. Ischemia is less blood supply. Anything which drops the blood pressure to such an extent that it decreases blood supply to the brain, specifically the VMC, causes a strong excitation reaction from the VMC. Sympathetics go haywire. Okay, they are supra stimulated, which causes a massive vasoconstriction all over the body. Okay, and the blood is diverted from all of the organs to the brain. So imagine all the doors to the organs are either shut or nearly shut, so that the blood is diverted, the entire volume is diverted to the brain, because if you can't save the brain in this situation, then the whole thing is lost, or the whole battle is lost. So any cerebral ischemia is basically a very alarming situation in the body, and the body literally shuts down most of its circulation to save the brain by massively going into vasoconstriction. This is mediated by the sympathetic part of the vasomotor center that uh, we have now recognized, and it's an emergency control system, and it kicks in only when the blood pressure falls below 60 mmHg, or even lower than that. Okay, so this is that brain ischemia, which basically gets triggered by a decrease in systemic arterial pressure. Please remember this. CNS ischemic response are of two types. One type I've explained to you, that the decrease in blood pressure is because of a disturbance in the systemic circulation elsewhere. The second type is called Cushing's reaction. Okay, the only difference, the reaction is the same. The only difference is, in this case, the disturbance comes from within the brain itself. So the ischemia, the cause of ischemia is different. Here, the cause of ischemia is outside of the brain. Here, it's within the brain. So any tumor or any other, say hydrocephalus, any other situation which causes increased intracranial pressure will cause constriction of the snubbing of the arteries, narrowing of the arteries of the cerebrum, and exactly the same thing would happen. Ischemia would happen, okay, and when ischemia would happen, again, blood supply to the VMC will decrease, and the same cascade of reactions will be done to save the brain blood supply. The only difference here is that the instigation, the trigger, happens to be the brain itself. Okay, this is an important viva question. Okay. Having done that, we go to the relatively minor chemoreceptor mechanisms. Remember the role of peripheral and central chemoreceptors. I've recorded detailed video lectures on the role of peripheral chemoreceptors and central chemoreceptors. Here, their role is not very major. So their role in blood pressure control is this, basically. If you remember, peripheral chemoreceptors, they reside again right next to their brothers, the baroreceptors, under the arch of aorta and at the bifurcation of carotids. And if you remember, their main stimulation is a drop in PO2. And if you really remember those lectures, you would remember that hypoxia or decreased arterial oxygen tension, coupled with an increase in carbon dioxide and hydrogen ions, really ramps up the peripheral chemoreceptor response. Uh, Lone decreases in PO2 are less potent than decreases in PO2 coupled with increases in carbon dioxide and hydrogen ions. Anyhow, so this is the main stimulus with or without the carbon dioxide hydrogen business. When the arterial PO2 goes down, it stimulates these peripheral chemoreceptors located here, which now you will study. This is new information for you. Over there, you studied in respiration, you studied that when hypoxia happens, it basically they get stimulated, the peripheral chemoreceptors, and then they trigger the DRG, the respiratory centers in the brainstem, and all sorts of increased ventilatory effort then starts to be triggered. But here we are obviously discussing circulation. So the same stimulus, besides turning on the ventilation, now you study that it also has an effect on the sympathetic vasoconstrictor center of the VMC, and it causes vasoconstriction in the major organs, so that the blood is made available in the arteries. It stays in the arteries so that it goes up. The arterial blood pressure goes up. So basically, what is happening is in this mechanism, a decrease in, or let's say a change in PO2 is translated into circulation language. Okay. So a decrease in PO2 is read as a decrease in blood pressure. Okay. And hence sympathetics are turned on and vasoconstriction takes place. Okay. There's a footnote here that this also causes a transient heart rate, decrease in heart rate by activating of parasympathetics. But this is a transient thing, and it sort of fades away quickly. Then you come to the central chemoreceptor. You know the location. It's they are part and parcel of the medulla. Again, medulla comes in again in the discussion. They're part of the brain, and in Cushing reaction type situation or anything which basically leads to CNS ischemia, cerebral ischemia, what would happen in that is carbon dioxide will start to immediately go up, hydrogen ions will start to go up, and what happens is central chemoreceptors, as you remember, they have not much to do with oxygen. However, they are very, very respondent to the hydrogen ion concentration and the carbon dioxide. So in this case, when you have ischemia, all sorts of stimulatory signals are now going to activate the central chemoreceptors, which detect these changes and directly increase, again, the sympathetic outflow, which again causes vasoconstriction, and the blood is diverted to the brain. And Cushing's reaction, the same thing happens. It's just that the place of the cause of ischemia is the brain itself. Uh, Again, finishing this off by saying that this is a minor component. However, it's an important tail, quote unquote, of the whole acute mechanisms. We then hop over to the intermediate mechanisms. Intermediate mechanisms are less tricky, so good news for you. And basically, Guyton's, I guess, mentions these three. These are there as well. They're the hormonal component to this whole story. But these three are basically what the examiner will be looking at when you get a question on the intermediate mechanisms. One is fluid shift, second is stress relaxation, and then basically a renin-based vasoconstrictor mechanism. So quickly, we talk about fluid shift. So imagine if you have an increase in blood pressure and it has not been, very importantly, it has not been addressed by the acute mechanisms. So it has stayed over on that timeline. Now the intermediate mechanisms come into play. Okay. And one of those is fluid shift. So at the capillary level, simply put, the fluid will come out of the capillary, bringing down the volume inside the blood vessels, and that will decrease the blood pressure. This is as simple as that. Stress relaxation again is a very simple mechanism. Uh, and again, let me mark my words here. you have a sustained blood pressure disturbance which has not been addressed by the acute mechanisms, and it has now come to the intermediate mechanisms. So the number two thing to study is stress relaxation. It's literally, as the name says, the vessels will dilate in response to a sustained increase in blood pressure. And when they dilate, the blood pressure comes down. Remember, fluid shift and stress relaxation are equally applicable on the vice versa situations, i.e., a decrease in blood pressure will cause fluid shift from the interstitium into the vessels, and stress relaxation will basically decrease, causing vasoconstriction if the blood pressure has gone down. Coming to renin-angiotensin vasoconstrictor mechanism, this is a main mechanism, and let me just tell you here that it has two components. One is you're seeing it, the vasoconstrictor element of it. There is another aspect, the aldosterone aspect, that then will take you into the long term. So be very, very clear about this system: renin, angiotensin, vasoconstrictor mechanism, and renin, angiotensin, aldosterone mechanism. The aldosterone one is the long term. A way to remember it is again manipulating the diameter of vessels is a quick fix method. So vasoconstrictor mechanism is a quick fix. So it will, in a timeline, it will come in earlier than long term. However, anything which has to do with A, kidney, B, blood volume itself, not the diameter of vessel, this will take time. Hormones take time. Remember whichever bit you remember better. Hormones take time to work. Aldosterone is a hormone. It will take time for it to be released from the adrenal gland. It will take time for it to rise up in the blood gradually. And then eventually it will start acting on the kidney to cause blood volume changes. Okay. This is all a long scenario, not very long, but it takes days to set in. Okay. Uh, Let me see if I need to go back to that main diagram. Um, this one here. So as you can see, this is what we are talking about. Aldosterone basically starts to get secreted in hours. However, uh, its effect takes place when it rises up. The gain that it gives you rises up, and through days it then improves the situation. It's really coming in late, but it basically adds to the overall renal response of the blood pressure mechanism to infinity. Okay. Vasoconstrictor mechanism is given in green. This is it. This is that vasoconstrictor mechanism. You can see that vasoconstriction can only go so far because it's, as I said, it's a stopgap arrangement working with diameters of vessels. You can only get so much. However, when you start to look at the actual disturbance of the blood pressure, the fundamental issue of the blood pressure is basically the blood volume. So when you start to deal with the blood volume of things, the gain is infinite because now you actually are handling the situation from its root. Okay. Going back quickly to the slide we were at, we were where were we were here. Okay. So when we talk about the vasoconstrictor component of the renin-angiotensin system, basically it comes in the intermediate sort of things, because before this, the mighty baroreceptor is doing its business. But when that doesn't come to work and that the curve is flattened of the baroreceptor reflex, you have renin-angiotensin trying to save the day. And we'll talk about this in a flow chart way in the coming slide. So let me just say this, that this component comes under the intermediate mechanisms. Then you have vasoconstrictors and vasodilators. We have discussed this, role of epinephrine, the receptors. You can have a good read of this from your textbooks. So this is intermediate mechanisms controlling blood pressure. Now the long term. Long term is really uh, uh, three things. More of this is one thing. Main thing is the aldosterone bit. But let me get this out of the way because it mentions it at the onset of the second chapter. It mentions pressure diuresis, natriuresis, and diuresis. So these are crude mechanisms. You have a barbecue meal, okay? You get thirsty. So what is happening is barbecue meal. Why is barbecue is high on salt and all those masalas that you have in it, which makes it tasty. But at the same time, then it triggers a thirst response by virtue of which you increase fluid intake as well. So basically, you're flooding the cardiovascular system with a lot of fluid, both salt and water. The kidney will simply increase the salt output, which is referred to as natriuresis, and increase the water output, which is referred to as diuresis, in the ensuing minutes to hours, so that the atrocity that you caused by having this meal and its attendant fluid is is worked out, sorted out, and extra salt is thrown out, extra water is thrown out, and that's it. This is basically these two terms, uh, really simplified. Guyton does go into details, graphical details. By graphical, I don't mean those graphical details, graph-based details, and basically mentioning the same basic concept that I've described. With this out of the way, look at this. This is the main renin-angiotensin aldosterone system. In the intermediate mechanisms, we studied renin-angiotensin vasoconstrictor mechanism. That is intermediate. This now, by virtue of a hormone, is long term. So what's happening? What's happening is you again start the proceeding with a decreased arterial blood pressure scenario. Okay. But in this case, we are looking at how the kidney gets affected by this whole thing. As I mentioned to you, the cardiovascular system, the mainstay of the cardiovascular system is to maintain mean arterial pressure. You didn't do that here. So it got decreased. When it got decreased, since mean arterial pressure ensures tissue perfusion, and if you decreased it, tissue perfusion will drop. Renal tissue perfusion is no exception. Okay. So in this case, as soon as the mean arterial pressure dropped, you have a decrease in renal perfusion pressure, which then, and this is second year stuff really. So just remember this: decreased renal pressure, perfusion pressure, leads to release of a hormone called renin. You probably have studied it in your A levels and your FSC. That renin gets released by the kidney. Let's keep it at that. And renin, being a hormone, basically needs a substrate. So angiotensinogen is a plasma protein. Again, remember this, please. This is one of I. It's crazy that such a simple information can be uh, turned into a mistake. It's not angiotensin, it's angiotensinogen. This is the substrate on which renin acts, makes it angiotensin 1. Then angiotensin 1 itself is not very active. Angiotensin 1 gets converted into angiotensin 2 by angiotensin converting enzyme, ACE. Remember the hypertension theme on the Facebook that I've been running throughout these lectures. And in that, the patient's name is what? Saqib, is it? He was then, uh, I remember the doctor's name, Dr. Orakzai. Uh, I'm, he eventually prescribes him a ACE inhibitor. Okay, this is that ACE. So if you give the person an ACE inhibitor, you're blocking this enzyme and you're blocking the formation of angiotensin 2. So today, when you study the four main things that angiotensin 2 does, you understand why you would want to give an ACE inhibitor inhibiting formation of angiotensin 2 in a hypertensive individual. Very important point to note and correlate with hypertension, which by the way will be discussed tomorrow in detail. Okay, so saddle up. Angiotensin 2 basically is a vasoconstrictor. As the name indicates, angio is vessel, tensin is tension. Okay, so angiotensin 2 is a very powerful vasoconstrictor, and when it gets released, it constricts arterioles, increasing TPR, and in itself, that is quite a major chunk of blood pressure coming back to normal. It also triggers thirst, which then gets you to drink fluids, which adds volume. Again, the pressure will respond. Volume and pressure are connected. You increase the intravascular volume, you increase pressure. Okay. Angiotensin-II, then this is an exchange mechanism. You should be able to understand exchange. Let's say symport mechanism. Okay. So in kidney, in the adrenal nephron, there's a place called proximal convoluted tubule. There are sodium hydrogen exchange mechanisms, i.e. receptors in that section of the nephron. And what happens is, I beg your pardon, this is an antiport mechanism. Please correct, antiport mechanism. So for every sodium that it absorbs, it would secrete a hydrogen. So it exchanges for each sodium that comes in the lumen of the tubule for a hydrogen that is formed within the tubular cell. So angiotensin-II basically increases this exchange, which basically means increased sodium reabsorption. And we know that sodium is related to volume. The more salt you retain, the, the more volume it will give you, and then it eventually goes to increase your blood pressure. And this then comes to aldosterone. Okay, so angiotensin-II actually activates aldosterone. So besides doing all of this, which by the way, in this flow chart is very, very well written here. It's given, it's given, it's a very nice visual view of it. Summarizes it. It's easy to remember. This is from BRS. Very good book to read summaries of things. Uh, so angiotensin-II basically increases aldosterone, and aldosterone is known for its sodium reabsorption by the tubule, the renal tubule, not the PCT, not the proximal convoluted tubule, but in case of aldosterone, it acts on the distal convoluted tubule to increase sodium reabsorption by the DCT. And then again, as whenever you look at sodium, you should think about volume. Increased sodium reabsorption will enhance the ECF volume, and that will then bring the blood pressure back to normal. This is the renin-angiotensin to aldosterone system, which is the mainstay of the long-term mechanisms which bring the blood pressure or keep the blood pressure to within normal range. Okay, so we have today discussed the timeline, the continuum from acute to long-term mechanisms of how cardiovascular system basically keeps the arterial blood pressure within normal range. Tomorrow, inshallah, we'll be looking at when things go wrong in hypertension. We will discuss what hypertension is after we have discussed some very important integrative cardiovascular scenarios such as change in posture, hemorrhage, and so on. Inshallah, see you tomorrow. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.